Hey everyone, this is Kevin from thechesswebsite.com. Today we are in round number 9, the final round of the 2017 Grand Prix in Geneva. And we have a treat because the top two players in the tournament are currently playing in the last round. White's going to be played by Nepomniachtchi and Black's going to be played by Teimour Radjabov. And it doesn't always happen like this, but in this tournament, Alexander Giri, who was tied for second, he drew earlier. So that means that one of these players will be the champion. White does need a victory to be the champion. He is a half a point behind, so he's going to need that full point to jump Teimour. But Black only needs a draw. So you can kind of get a sense for what both sides are going to be looking to do in this game. White starts out with pawn to e4, pawn e5, knight f3, knight c6, and then bishop to c4, getting into the Italian game, or the quiet game. And we see a lot more of the Ruy Lopez with bishop to b5, but in this particular game, bishop here to c4. Knight f6, pawn to d3. Much more common to see pawn c3 getting ready to push forward with pawn to d4 in the center, but kind of takes more of a quieter approach. This is the very quiet game, if you will. Bishop to c5, castle on the king side, pawn d6, and then pawn c3. So White's going to be looking to develop his pieces a little bit more, and then eventually at some point he will want to be playing this pawn to d4 in the center of the board. Pawn to a6, and then pawn up here to a4. Castle on the king side for Black, pawn h3, just stopping some of the squares that Black can come down to. Knight g4 is now blocked off. Bishop to g4, pinning down the knight to the queen is blocked off. And so Black does the same thing, pawn to h6. You can tell from Black's point of view, he's fine playing this, what I would consider a drawish game. Variation in the Italian game. So you're not going to see him doing anything too crazy right now. He has a good position. He's not under any pressure right now. He's just going to see what his opponent does, knowing that if he gets a draw, he is the champion in the tournament. One thing that's important to note about these top grandmasters is they know all the games that have been played, especially recent games in tournaments. They know all the variations. They have teams behind them that are studying these. They want to know if another top player has found a particular line that maybe is a novel line that hasn't been played much. They want to see how different players are thinking about it. Just last month, we had Magnus Carlsen, Wesley So playing in Norway for the big chess tournament there. And Magnus Carlsen was playing the white pieces. Wesley So was playing the black pieces. And we saw Wesley So play bishop to e6. And then after the exchange, we see pawn takes on e6. A little bit interesting from Wesley So that he would immediately go ahead and open up this f-file and have double pawns in the center. Now, double pawns in the center, not as bad if you have a pawn next to it here on the d-file. A lot of ways for you to get rid of that double pawn, and it really allows you to control much of the center of the board. Not only is it controlling the dark squares, but this pawn here on e6 is also controlling these light squares as well. But play continued, pawn up here to b4. So Magnus Carlsen tried to push into his advantage on the queen side. Bishop back here, a7. We did see an exchange. Now White has a double pawn on the e-file. Knight e7, knight b to d2, knight g6, pawn push forwards a little bit. But this game ended in a draw. Now, from Black's perspective, you could look at this and say, okay, draw is great because that would give me the victory in the championship. But if you kind of look at it, it's not an easy game to play. So while I'm pretty confident that Teimour was prepared for this, if you wanted to go down this line, I do think the pawn to h6 is much safer, and he doesn't have to worry about any of the complications that could have come from the game that he saw from Magnus Carlsen and Wesley So. Rook over here to e1. This does a couple things. One, it does protect the pawn on e4, but it also allows him, if he wants to, bring his bishop to e3, not have to worry about recapturing with this pawn. He can now recapture with his rook if he'd like to. Now Black decides to go and bring his bishop to a7, knight d2, knight back here to e7, and this kind of signals that it's go time. White needs to do a couple things. He needs more defenders or attackers on the d4 square, or he needs his opponent to retreat some of his attackers or defenders on the d4 square. That's exactly what White sees right now. The knight here on c6 was defending the square here on d4, and so after the knight moves, then it's kind of go time for white here. So pawn pushing forward to d4, trying to take control of the center of the board. Black's completely okay with that. Just brings his knight over here to g6, says, yeah, go ahead and do your thing. That's fine if you want to. Bishop down here, f1. This is kind of one of those interesting moves of you have a very strong attack in the center of the board. Bishop coming back here to f1 just seems counterintuitive. There's so many other ways that white can continue here. Queen to b3, developing the queen, really eyeing in this long white diagonal. That seems really good. Could also just play queen to c2, get involved into the action, protecting the square here on e4, so it doesn't have to worry about his rook or his knight as well. Could play knight to b3, just get it out of the way so the queen is protecting the square here on d4. Also, just want to open up the door for the dark square bishop to get involved at some point in the game. Or you can just play pawn to b4. Just say, hey, if you want to bring your knight over here, that's fine. I'm going to go ahead and take this opportunity to start pushing on the queen side. All of those, I think, are much more aggressive plays from white. And if you're playing for the win, which white really needs to be playing for the win, a draw does him no good unless he just wants to get second place. But I think you should be playing for the win here with the white pieces. So all in all, bishop to f1 is a fine move. I just think there were other options that gave him more opportunity to press his advantage as white. Rook to e8, just protecting the center of the board. Now queen to c2. Knight back here to h7. So playing somewhat defensive. Knight to h7, trying to bring it to another square. Knight here to g4. Could bring it back here to f6 if he wants to, but not really doing too much with that knight here on h7 right now. Pawn takes on e5, recaptures, knight up here to c4. Attacking the pawn, queen down here eventually wants to get that involved, so decides to go and bring it here to f6. Attacking both the knight, putting more pressure on the pawn right here on g2, protecting that. Also defending the square here on e5. Knight to e3. And then knight up here to e7, knight g4, attacking the pawn and the queen, and we just see an exchange right here. So bishop takes on g4, the pawn recaptures, knight here to g6, bishop here to c4. And this is kind of nice because it allows black, if he wants to bring his knight down here to f4. That's going to be a great little outpost. First decides to go and bring his rook to d8. You really want to have your major pieces controlling the center of the board, and that's exactly what he does here. Rook here to d8. He has both of his rooks in the center. Black has a pretty good position. He's going to need to get his knights involved into the action. White has double bishops, so he needs to really open up the center of the board, control the game with those bishops. This dark square bishop over here, white definitely has to be aware of that. It does control this entire dark square diagonal from a7 all the way down to the king here. So that is going to be putting pressure on white. Pawn pushing forward to a5. I'm not sure it's doing too much, but decides to go and push his advantage on the queen side of the board. Knight down here to f4 as we talked about. And then knight coming to h2. Seems a little bit odd to bring your knight back to h2. It does protect the pawn on g4, but it's not like he's maneuvering the knight to h2 to go somewhere else. There's no other squares he can go to unless you want to come back to the first rank, which seems kind of bad, and then pushing forward to e3. So this seems a little defensive, in my opinion, for white. The white pawn's not really under any pressure right now, so I don't think he has to do this. He had some other options. You can now play bishop to e3, and then if there is an exchange on board, you could take with your pawn. Although it is double pawns, it forces the knight to move, and I think that's going to be fine on board. But in the game, decided to go and play knight to h2. Teimour continues rook d7, getting ready to bring his other rook over here to d8 with the double rooks control the only open file in the game. Bishop to e3, so we eventually see this, and then the pawn takes. Much rather take with your rook because you don't want to have double pawns in the center of the board, especially if you don't have pawns on either side of it. But this knight here on f4 just has to go. It's such a very powerful outpost that decides to go ahead and take with his pawn to force the knight back. So knight comes back here to e6, and then rook to f1, trying to control the semi-open file, forcing the queen to move. Queen back here to e7, pawn pushes forward to b4, just solidifying the pawn chain, making sure the queen can't come by as well. Knight to g5. I really like knight to f6. It attacks both of these pawns here on g4. In e4 ties down the queen to the pawn and the knight to the pawn. So I think this was more aggressive. And I recognize that black doesn't have to be too aggressive, but I just think it's all in all a better move than knight here to g5. But this is what he decides to play. Now knight to f3. If black wants to exchange, and he decides to go ahead and do that, pawn recaptures on f3. So both sides trading down, which I think bodes well for black, equal in material here. So I think it's a little bit easy for him to draw in the game. Queen down here to g5, just attacking the backward bishop here, or the pawn on e3. Rook to e1, protecting the pawn. Rook here to d8, doubled up on the d file. Queen over here, h2. And then rook to d2. You always want to get your rooks both doubled up, and then also on your opponent's second rank if you're black. For white, you want to get up here on the 7th rank. You can get behind enemy line, start to pick off some of your opponent's pawns. Also just limits some of the squares your opponent can go to, specifically his king. Rook here to e2. Could see an exchange on board. Decides first to come down to d2. So if there's an exchange, he can come down with some tempo. First, we see bishop to d5, trying to block off these rooks connected. And then there's an exchange on board. Pawn to c6, forcing the bishop to move. We see an exchange, but first, rook down here, d1 check. King to f2, and then the exchange. So now black and white both have the double pawn structure on the e-file. Black is fine here. He has some very active pieces. He just doesn't have a lot of them. So right now it's just a matter of getting into the end game, see if any side can really get behind enemy lines and make something of it. Right now I would say if anyone, it's black, because white's playing pretty defensive right now. And then white plays what I thought was a kind of a white flag of, all right, I'm not even going to try for the win. Let's just go and exchange queens off the board. Black didn't take too long to go ahead and just take on h5. As you can probably imagine, this makes it much easier for him to draw the game. So we see the queens come off the board. King here to f7, starting to activate the king. King now is a very valuable piece getting into the endgame. Rook here to b2, rook c1, rook d2, controlling the open file. King e7, now the rook can't really do too much. He'd like to come here to d7. That would be the dream square. You can get behind enemy lines. King to e7 is going to stop that. Rook to d3, rook over here h1, attacking the pawn. Is going to end up losing that pawn, so black goes up material. Pawn c4, we see some checks back and forth, getting some time back on the clock once you get to a certain move, and so that's kind of what we see here. And then rook to g5, king over here to h2, pawn h4, so just pushing on the king side while white pushes on the queen side. Pawn h4, king up here to h3. And then rook down here to g3 is pretty interesting. Decides to go ahead and give up his passed pawn on the h file for the pawn here on the f file. And that's fine. Still has a passed pawn on g7 that he can push if he wants to. Or, all in all, he could just easily get to the end game and have a drawed game. So pawn takes on a6, pawn recaptures, pawn up here to c5. Rook down here f1, rook to d6. It's an outpost, but it's not doing too much. Rook over here to a1 says, if you want to go ahead and take my pawn, that's fine. I'll take yours as well. And that's what they decide to do. King to g5. But with the rook over on the a file, this pawn, it's not really going to be able to hold on for very long. King to d7, forcing the rook to move. Rook here to d6. It's an outpost. Check. And then we see some back and forth from both sides. At the end of the day, there is a twofold repetition. Both sides say, let's go ahead and draw this thing. Neither side's probably going to win here. So congratulations to Teimour. He is your champion after tying the last game. He played a phenomenal tournament. And then Jan Nepomniachtchi, he got second. He tied with Alexander Grishik, so congratulations to him. Teimour's still in the running for being one of the top two in the Grand Prix. Had a strong finish in the last tournament in the Grand Prix. Ended up winning this one. So if he can get first, potentially second, depending on where everything is sorted out, he will be one of the top two. So congratulations to him on a victory. I would have liked to see maybe white push a little bit harder with a variation that's more complicated, or try in this position specifically to try something to put Black to the test. I think all in all, Black had a pretty easy game to get to a draw state. But great tournament. Really enjoyed the coverage. So thank you all for watching and following along, and I will see you in the next tournament. Thanks, everyone.